On a white background, printed in fuzzy black capitals, are the words artificial things, the letters coming to crisp focus before it all goes black. From the darkness materializes slowly an expansive indoor space, a deserted shopping mall. Light slants into its wide emptiness. Abandoned shop fronts are taped or boarded up on either hand, with graffiti sprayed onto the boards or across the glass. We glide forward, low down over the once shiny floor, where gloomy daylight now catches thick dust. We pass dark pillars and plate glass marked off with yellow and black hazard tape. We turn a corner from the derelict arcade and come to a halt. Low down through an open glass door, Dave travels towards us on his hands, pushing down to shift his torso forward and rest it on the ground with each movement. His legs end above the knee. Dave has dark hair and a beard and large soulful eyes. The short sleeves of his pale peach shirt reveal his long muscular arms. Chris bangs his arms on an old shop counter. He wears a managerial grey suit and pale peach tie. Around him, his derelict shop floor extends in all directions, and at the back a faded sign reads, "Please pay here." Chris repeats tight, defined gestures, wagging his finger forbiddingly, twisting his own head with his hands, beating one hand into the other palm as if to drive a point home. Chris shakes and glowers, pumping his fists, breathing heavily. He slaps his palm and moves his hands down and up with the fingers splayed upwards. He smears his hand down his left side and pumps his elbow up and down, while Dave shuffles across behind him and becomes hidden by the shop counter. Manager Chris comes forward and points to us with a scowl. Dave pops out through an opening in the counter. He puts a hand to his chest and thrusts forward in time with Chris, who twists his own head with his hands, hugs himself, and flings his arms open. Standing wide, Chris rocks from foot to foot, turns his back, snaps his heels together, shuffles away from us, and then turns back pointing at us while Dave touches his heart. Dave ambles forward on his thighs and hands. Chris follows him. Dave stops and sits. He rests his chin on his hand and raises an eyebrow at us. Chris, chin on hand, turns his back again, waddles away, and does an exaggerated about turn, swinging his leg out high. He marches away off to the left, where we catch up with him, swooping his arms high and diving them down. Chris spins rigidly, with one elbow up and the other down. Then, with hands on hips, he strides back near Dave, beckoning wildly. From down on the floor, Dave regards him coolly and slaps him on the backside. Chris bats Dave back on the shoulders and tries to order him away with some firm pointing. Dave and Chris turn their backs on each other. Chris folds his arms, pouting. He peers round behind him to Dave over one shoulder and then the other. He leans down and taps Dave on the shoulder. When Dave turns round, Chris pushes him firmly to the ground. Chris flaps his arms to drive Dave away. As Dave scoots off, Chris stretches out his broad body, raises his fists high, and shakes them triumphantly. Alone now, Chris sits on the floor, sweeps his leg around, and spins around on one knee, then slides low across the floor. He steps back, arm high, wiggles his hand towards his face, and bends forwards and back. He circles his head around rigorously and shakes his head in his hands. He flings his arm around, kicks his leg out, spins around, puts a palm out and jabs a finger into it. He points to the side, back, up and forward, frowning and authoritative. His movements get more frantic as he rolls around on the floor, swinging his arms back and forth. He presses one hand on the floor, then the other as he spins around. On his knees, he shakes his fist at the heavens, wags his arms, flings himself down, drags himself across the floor. He gets up, bends backwards, and does a half cartwheel low down. Walks backwards, arms spread in the great urban space, hands to head, holding on, and then spread wide again. He glares at himself in a mirror, which is stuck with yellow and orange tape. Reflected in this mirror, he shakes a fist angrily at his reflection in another mirror. Dropping to the floor, he writhes on his back. He gets up and gives a stern ticking off to his own reflection. The lights go out. Behind the disused pay counter are vandalised display panels with gaping, ragged holes. Chris is back, solitary and determined. He pumps his arms together up and down, beats his fist repeatedly on his palm, strictly controlling the rhythm. Behind the desk, he urgently addresses the empty space, beating his hand across his palm and wagging his finger at us with more and more vigour, firmly, aggressively, until he collapses forward, whacking his head down to rest on his forearm on the counter. The scene fades to black. A dim silhouette takes shape of someone resting alone on the floor. Square ceiling lights stutter into life. A checkerboard of neon floods white light onto Laura as she lies on her side. Her brown hair is smoothed into a bun, and she's immaculate in a modest grey blouse and smart trousers. Laura's draped elegantly over a dismantled, overturned wheelchair seat. Two large wheels are detached and lie some way behind her on the desolate shop floor. Her knees are slightly bent and she lies with her elbows under her on the chair seat. Dave approaches Laura, tentatively. She lifts her head, half glances over her shoulder but keeps her back to him. Her lips are pressed together. With her arms, she hoists herself off the wheelchair seat and manoeuvres her right hip carefully to the floor. She peeps cautiously at him. She sits up and her legs flop straight out in front of her. She holds on to the wheelchair protectively, her neat shoulders slightly hunched in defence. She places her left hand precisely on her right shin and looks briefly at him. Dave steals closer. He watches her intently and slowly, tenderly, lays his hand next to hers and pulls to shift her legs slightly. He slides his hand off her and moves away. She averts her eyes, yet still responds to him. He brushes his shoulder against the back of her arm. She lifts her elbow in response, and he gently ducks his head up through the crook of her arm and hops his hands over her still legs to lean across her. Barely touching, yet intertwined, they breathe heavily in unison, isolated together in the vast expanse of the abandoned shop floor. She looks at the back of his head and nuzzles her cheekbone gently against it to brush him away. As he moves off, she twists round to watch him. Dave travels round behind her and then lifts himself up onto her hips and back and sits facing the wheelchair seat. He clasps the handle on the back of its frame to pull himself onto the floor again. Laura sits upright. She leans, fondly half smiling towards his back. She places her hand on the wheelchair seat, then closes her eyes and rests her forehead against his shoulder, drawing him upwards. Head touching head, they rise and sink together. They draw apart, look at each other, turn away and then back towards each other. They rest, her head laid gently on his shoulder, cheek to cheek. Dave grips onto the overturned wheelchair and hoists himself up to balance above it, his body raised clear of the frame. She looks up into his face, and he leans down and nuzzles against her. She bows her head to dip under his chest, and he slides himself down along her spine to the floor behind her. She looks gratified and glances back at him. With her hands, she raises a knee and hooks one arm under it and through to the other leg. He doesn't take his eyes off her neat features. Calmly, she tips her head backwards, her eyes closed, reveling in his attentions, whilst looking coyly away. She whips her head round to peek at him. As she removes her hand from the chair, he raises his hand in sync with a parallel gesture. He gazes at her. She leans towards him, then circles her torso flexibly from the hips, using her arms to sweep her legs round. She lies on her side by the frame, lowers her cheek down onto the seat back, bending her leg with her fingers curved back. Dave goes to her, puts his hand on her hip, and draws himself up over her hip, her back, her head, and onto the wheelchair frame, where he supports himself with his muscular arms. He turns himself around to face her. Sitting on the frame, he rocks it back so that it balances on different points, its two tiny wheels touching the floor. She looks at him, her hand still on the tilted chair. As he reaches for her hand, she takes it away. She tips to the side, and at the same moment, he rocks the chair seat back again. He turns his back, then rotates to face her again. He approaches her, sinks down between her and the chair, rests his hand on it. Laura pulls the wheelchair towards her. He pushes it away again and tips it over on its side. Dave swings himself quickly up onto the chair, sits and challenges her with a stare. She blinks slowly up at him, breathing deeply. Now she reaches for his hand, and he draws away first. His hand hovers over hers, and as she moves closer to lie down by the chair, he cradles his hand under her cheek and lowers her head almost to the ground. He watches tenderly as she slowly comes to rest. In front of whitewashed shop windows, Amy walks tall and stops. David, another standing dancer, joins her and bends his forehead near hers. They don't touch. Side by side, they dip down, heads bowed, one arm stretched forward. They rise, reach up, fluidly pass their limbs round and over each other's bodies. David ripples his long body, drags one foot in a half circle, and draws Amy by the forearm to lunge alongside him. With his wrist on the back of her hand, they stand and spin and pose with knees bent. With barely any contact, he leads her, often cupping her slender form with his broad chest and shoulders, the backs of their hands in contact. They sense each other's graceful moves by light pressure and awareness, and mirror each other. Slowly, smoothly, they rise and fall together, hunch over in sync, always close but rarely touching, dipping, turning, swooping their arms, supporting each other to lean, arching backwards. Everything is pale, the diffuse light, his short-sleeved shirt, her top and skirt. The darkest things are his hair and moustache and her chin-length ringlets. They regularly pause. She holds a pose, squatting with knees and elbows splayed and forearms straight up, while he, lifting one leg, shapes himself around her and then unwraps from her. He spins her round suddenly into a tango-like pose, facing past each other one way, then both switching to face the other way. She rests her slender fingers on his arm and he gently jumps her a short step, then supports her to arch back over his knee. She slices forward in an arc and spins. They inhale together, dreamily spin around, part on either side of a glass panel and then join each other on the far side of it. In a large space she cartwheels, and he holds her suspended, upside down, her short ringlets fanning out and trembling. He puts her down. She touches his forehead, and he closes his eyes, blissfully. She spins his whole body and hers by twisting his head softly between her palms. They spin, swoop, weave around each other, barely grazing. Chest to chest, she takes his weight on her thigh, and then he swings her off the floor. She gently clasps his head again and spins them both, and they riff off each other in bigger motions, all matched, slow or sudden as they sense each other's moves. They step and whirl, respond to each other's gestures, and he lifts her to spin and set her down again. They fall into each other's shapes, closing and opening, but never parting. She reaches high and he shadows her. They grip each other by the wrist. Under the stark lights, in the wide, pale space, she leans right back as he anchors her safely. Then they dance past mirrored pillars. He scoops her high to balance on his shoulder, where she breasts the air, her legs straight out behind. He sets her down again. She jumps him over her shoulder and down again. He lifts her high, upside down, her legs reaching straight up, her feet almost touching the dilapidated tiles and bright neon lights of the ceiling. He puts her down slowly, and they stand up and face us, still holding hands lightly, catching their breath. Now their fingers separate as Amy and David look straight ahead together. They gaze across the abandoned space, across a bare distance. Suddenly we are very low down, close up, with both duos in mid-dance by the wheelchair. Amy and Laura sit close, dancing. David, crouching with Dave on his back, turns and sinks to the floor. Dave rolls off across the floor. They reach and slide Dave close to the group. Amy and Dave help Laura to roll onto and over David's hunched back. Laura lies on her back. Laura reaches towards Amy as Amy sits on David's back. Amy lifts the wheelchair seat up to rest on its two small wheels. Dave takes it and wheels it to him. He pulls it down to rest against his chest and then the floor. Laura draws Amy down towards her by the hand and then the shoulder. Amy does a low cartwheel over Laura and onto the floor beside her. Then she and David help Laura to sit up. The two women rest their foreheads against the overturned wheelchair frame, and David lies on it and rolls over the wall. The four of them move in a close, fluid knot, shifting over and around each other continuously, touching and connected. David stands up tall, and Amy touches his hand gently and draws him back low again. He shifts the wheelchair seat, and Amy does a forward roll over the seat and over David's back, Laura helping her lift her leg gracefully with the toe pointed. Laura half smiles at Dave, plants her arm for him. He leans against it and she sweeps it up and over him. She pulls her legs round to sit back to back with Amy. David lies on his back with his hips next to theirs, his knees close to his chest, his feet raised near their shoulders. Dave approaches this huddle, and as he hauls himself up on the women's shoulders and balances between them, David fits his feet into Dave's armpits and lifts him high. Dave, suspended, holds his arms out to the sides as the women move to lie on the floor, looking up at his back. At the counter, manager Chris joins the two wheelchair dancers and the other two standing dancers. The five of them are static in a group pose, all looking into the distance in different directions. Chris is at the back, behind the counter. Dave rests on the counter. On either side, David and Amy sit on chairs in front of the counter. Laura sits in her wheelchair beside Amy. With no apparent signal, someone shifts, and they all move round and form a tableau in different positions, again close but not touching. For a third and fourth time, they feel a change as one and pose in a new configuration, shaken up and resettling, fixed together but looking into the distance. All 5 dancers power freely into an airy, light-filled atrium. Individually, they perform bravura dance moves across the bright space, and in shifting pairs and trios, dance in sync or reflect each other's motion. In the foreground, Dave spins on his hands exactly in time. Amy does powerful jerks with Dave, then, beaming, balances on one leg. Dave does a forward shoulder roll, and another roll. Amy does the splits. Chris struts with his arms behind his back, then bunny hops with Amy and David. Dave and David twitch their shoulders and smooth their hair like Elvis. Amy and David throw in touches of jive and Charleston and joyful high kicks. David swings Laura around in her chair. They rock and roll, and she whizzes around him, smiling. Chris lifts and thrusts aside an open-mouthed Amy. Amy stomps off. Chris spins low and rolls on the floor with David. Then they stand for a tight vertical spin. Amy leaps high and lands to pull Laura's wheelchair back. David rolls on and off Laura's lap before lifting Amy high and twirling her like a propeller. Chris checks behind a pillar. No one there. The rock and roll is unrestrained and jubilant. Laura in her chair spins energetically and races up and down with Amy. David and Chris shake fists at each other. Dave pulls himself up into his chair and nods to the beat, watching the others dance exuberantly. Dave shakes a long finger in time with the bell. They fling themselves about, their actions extreme, joyous. All 5 come into sync, pecking like pigeons. They face the same way, rocking deeply in time. They sweep their arms up and over, uninhibited, rapturously lost in the rhythm. They crisscross forward and back and diagonally, totally owning the huge space, smiling throughout their spirited display of skill and teamwork. Chris exerts his authority, waving his arms to herd the other dancers this way and that. They continue to dance with intense delight, slicing the air with their arms or legs as they whirl and wheel triumphantly. Gradually, Chris shoos them right out and follows them off. The dancers are gone. The huge space is left vacant once more, but still filled with light.
Blackout. The credits are printed in white. The dancers were David Toole, who was referred to as Dave, Christopher Pavia, Laura Jones, Amy Butler, and David Wildridge. The choreographer was Lucy Bennett. The film was directed and edited by Sophie Fiennes and produced by Brooke Crowley and Martin Rosenbaum. The Stopgap Dance Company, the artistic director is Lucy Bennett, executive producer Sho Shibata, producer and location finder Callum Graham, associate producer Lou Rogers, costumes Anna Jones for Curious Space, composers Andy Higgs and Jim Pinchin, Foley, Naden Pohan. Access workers, Lily Norton and Simon Cripps. Cinematographer, Remco Schnorr. Camera assistant, Chris Hayden. Grip, Rhys Hernshaw. Loader, Ashley Downs. Production assistant, Tom Graham. Additional sound recording, Ian McPherson. It was shot on location in Reading, England. Location manager, Luke Dobson for Z Adventures. Film processing, Cinelab London. Post-production, Hijack Post. Colourist, Alex Seary. Dubbing mixer, Rich Simpson. Music included You'd Be So Nice to Come Home To, performed by Nina Simone, song by Cole Porter, rights administered by Warner Chappell North America Limited, and Old Songs, New Songs, performed by Family, written by John Whitney and Roger Chapman, used by kind permission of Carling Music Corporation. The work was commissioned by The Space, Chief Executive and Creative Director Fiona Morris. Copyright 2018 Lone Star. Audio description by Mo Pickering for Rationale Productions.